Looks about right. Good evening, everyone. Hey, Boris is here. Yay! Hi, Boris. Anyway,
I'm the crowd.
He's the crowd. We have a crowd of one for another summer edition of the the monthly photo club meeting. Hang on, let me try one thing here. I'm gonna. No, dang it. What's my? I'm gonna try and see if I can see the stream itself. I have the volume turned off on here, so I don't hear myself talking to myself. Anyway, so this is the monthly meeting. I'm trying to see if I can get the chat client up so I can see what the heck's going on. Here we go. There's the chat client. Boris is watching. I think that's you, Boris, watching there. Let me see if
I'm not seeing anything or hearing anything.
Okay, so hopefully some of the folks tune in. Anyway, so again, welcome to the July meeting. So we're going to be discussing today. We have hey Bob made it too. So Bob's here too. Yay, Bob. Okay.
Yeah, double the crowd size.
Our crowd size just doubled. Anyway, so for tonight's beginners class, we are going on to camera basics part 4. Previously, we discussed things like the components of the camera, the lenses, lens selection, when to use what kind of lens, the rules of thumb, because they're not laws, they're just rules. You know, just generally a good idea. Okay, you can do anything you want. Who cares, right? It's art. So tonight we're going to talk about one of the main controls you will be using, especially on your digital camera, although it does apply to film cameras as well, which is the mode dial. Okay, on most cameras, the mode dial. Excuse me.
The commercial is brought to you by Coke.
Yes. Not sponsored by Coca-Cola, because I get no money from them. Anyway, hint, hint. Anyway, so the mode dial controls the basic behavior of your camera and how it's going to interact with you and how it's going to take an exposure. Okay, the dial is usually mounted at the top of the camera, although in some odd configurations it has been known to be on the front and also buried in menus. Okay, depending on your camera. Like a GoPro, the modes are buried in menus. Same thing on your iPhone. Your iPhone camera, if you have an iPhone camera that has a mode dial, it'll be buried in a menu, or it'll be some sort of virtual dial. Okay, so we're going to go through what each of the modes are generally, so you have an idea of what they are and when they apply, and then we'll discuss kind of like use cases when you want to use which mode. Again, these are rules of thumb, general ideas, and how to do it. Okay, so the basic modes are M, manual. Photographer sets everything, although it is possible on some cameras to be in manual mode and still be auto ISO. So you can have, you can set shutter speed and aperture, but let the ISO range up and down. And that's useful in situations where you're going to have variable lighting, but you cannot afford to have your shutter speed go below a certain speed, and you can't afford to lose depth of field. And to be honest with you, I've run into that a lot shooting professional dance, because they're running around like athletes on that stage, and you need a little bit of depth of field to make sure you catch them perfectly. You don't want to use super thin depth of field, so you want to have a little depth of field, but the lights are going to be going up and down and you have no control over it. So the only way you can compensate for that is to use auto ISO. in manual mode. So you set a shutter speed, you set an aperture, and let the ISO range up and down to accommodate for changes in lighting. The other thing to do is remember to control your metering. Narrow down your metering, because if you try to evaluate the whole scene, you might have someone in a spotlight and the rest of the scene is dark, and it's going to try and evenly expose the whole thing, and then it looks like somebody set them on fire. Okay, literally. So the next one is aperture priority, which can be an A or an AV if you have a Canon camera. And in this one, the photographer sets an aperture, meaning you are setting how much depth of field you want to have in your shot, and the camera will take care of the rest, shutter speeds and ISO and such. Okay? This is generally what I found to be very good for use for like walking around kind of street type shooting, and for parties and things like that. If you're going to be at a party or something like that, just kind of give yourself a nice f4 or something like that if you have a fast lens, so you have a little bit of depth of field, and that way you can kind of get your little groups and things like that, and not have to, and the camera will take care of the rest of the work for you. Okay. The next one is shutter priority, which is S, or strangely enough TV on Canon cameras. Don't know why, but well, TV because it actually stands for time value. So as opposed to aperture, and the other one's aperture value. But anyway, in this case, you set a shutter speed, and the camera will range the aperture and ISO to accommodate whatever shutter speed you pick. Okay? Then you have program priority, which is sort of I don't want to worry about it, where you let the camera make most of the decisions. And then the last one you have auto priority, which could be the word auto or a green box. Or a green box with the word auto in it. And that's similar to program priority, where the camera makes all the decisions, but also if you have a built-in flash, it will pop up the built-in flash as it sees fit.
As in my T2i.
Yes. Higher end cameras will not have this kind of an auto function because they don't have pop-up flashes. So anyway, now the mode dial also has some additional modes which are specialized, and these specialized modes are action mode, which usually has a little picture of a running man, okay, which is similar to S mode, where you set a shutter speed, but it switches the autofocus system to continuous tracking and favors faster shutter speeds. So it's kind of like a cross between program mode and S mode, where it's going to actually, instead of you setting a shutter speed, it's actually going to favor the faster shutter speeds, and it's going to switch your autofocus from single shot focus and take a shot to continuous, where it's metering the subject at all times and adjusting the focus at all times. So, for running and moving subjects. Okay? The next one is portrait, usually symbolized by a silhouette of a female head. Okay? Which is similar to aperture mode, where it's gonna, and again, these are program modes, so they're fully automatic. But it's gonna favor wider apertures, more open apertures, and adjusts the white balance, which sets the color tone more towards skin, favorable to skin colors. Okay? Then you have night shot, which usually have a little picture of a stick figure with the moon next to them, or a picture of the moon. Again, favoring slower shutter speeds and longer exposures, and could fire the flash, the built-in flash, on the second shutter curtain. This is called second curtain release, because normally when you take a photograph with flash, the shutter will, in a classic shutter which has a front curtain and a closing curtain, after the front curtain opens, the flash fires, and then the second curtain closes. In second curtain release, the front curtain will open, but the flash won't fire until the second curtain starts traveling. And the reason why you do that is because it lets you expose the background and get the background filled in a dark scene, and then you pop the flash to light your subjects. So that way you can see the subjects with a lit up background as opposed to them sitting in front of darkness, standing in total darkness. And that's kind of an advanced setting called second curtain release. There's a landscape automatic mode, which, like I said, these are automatic, so you don't actually set anything, but it favors stop-down apertures so that you have more depth of field and for taking landscapes. And then there's macro mode, which will actually not only stop down the aperture, but favor closer focusing. In other words, it'll bias your focus to, it'll tell it to ignore anything past a certain distance and not try to focus past a certain distance, which you can do that. For example, here's an example of aperture mode, which I shot at Half Dome in Yosemite Park. Anyway, so getting into aperture mode. Best for everyday use by photographers who want to maintain some control over their images. I mean, aside from going to program mode, which program mode will just do everything for you and you hope for the best. Okay, you control the depth of field and the camera handles the rest. Shutter speed and ISO vary to compensate, and like you would use it if you wanted to do, if you're doing portraits on your own, you could use it to do that, where I want to have shallow depth of field and my subject will have separation from the background. Okay. Shutter mode is suited for action photography when you want a consistent shutter speed to stop or blur the action, depending on what you want to do. Aperture and ISO vary to compensate. And an example of that was here at Yosemite Falls, where I wanted to stop the falls instead of letting them blur. Okay. Now, program mode, and it sounds like I'm poo-pooing program mode, and I'm not. There's a time and place for all these things. And this is great if you want to do snapshot photography. Basically, I'm seeing stuff, I want to take pictures of them, and I don't want to have to worry about the exposure that much. I'm more worried about composing the photograph. I'm just going to let the camera do all the work. So if you want to concentrate on your compositional skills and not have to worry about the exposure, you put it in program mode and let it do the work, and then you just worry about the composition. Now, if you happen to use a mirrorless camera, you also have the advantage of you get to preview the exposure in your viewfinder ahead of time. So you'll have an idea of what the image is actually going to look like when you take it, as opposed to using a regular DSLR with an optical viewfinder, which will look the same regardless of what your settings are. Okay. Again, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO vary according to need. And here's an example. Okay. Now, the last one we're going to talk about of the basic modes is manual mode. This is all you. You set the aperture, you set the shutter speed, you optionally set the ISO. Okay? And this is used for those situations where the camera is going to get fooled by the situation. Okay? For example, last night's full moon. Normally, when you try and photograph the moon, it's a brilliant white dot in the sky, because the camera is trying to evaluate the whole sky and get a balanced exposure for both. And it can't, because the moon is literally the second brightest object in the sky after the sun. And it is orders of magnitude brighter than everything else around it. And I'm talking about thousands of times brighter. The camera has not been made that has the dynamic range to be able to take a moonshot like this with stars. The human eye can, but not a camera. We're talking about 30 or 40 stops of dynamic range here. Okay? The moon is that bright.
Magnitude -11, if I remember right.
Yes. Yes. It is that bright. Magnitude -11 in astrophysical terms. Okay? So in order to do this, okay, when I shot, I did one shot, and I'll show it to you later on the group page, of the sky with the moon and the clouds at night, and I actually wanted the moon to be blown out because the way it was lighting the clouds, it was actually backlighting the clouds. It was a very interesting shot, and it almost looked like the clouds were worshiping the moon. It was very interesting. And then Mervyn came and asked me, because he was trying to take photographs of the moon as well, but he was complaining about it being a white dot. And I said, that's because it's so bright. And in order to take this photograph, my settings for this photograph were 1/250th of a second, f11 at ISO 200.
Here's one way to verify, you know how you can see the back by going to the display on your back screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You could go that way
Mm-hmm.
and then get your focus, and then you can see what you're actually going to be looking at.
Right. On DSLRs, you can use the rear display. But caveat emptor, when you do that, you lose phase detect autofocus. Because the mirror has to be down in order for the phase detect to work, because the phase detect cells are by the prism.
Oh.
With mirrorless cameras, the phase detect cells are in the sensor. Okay? Technical detail. Because I know some people that had a DSLR, and they were shooting on the live screen all the time, and they couldn't understand why the focus was so slow, and they read everywhere that the camera had super fast focus. Because when you're using the live screen on the back, you're using contrast detection as opposed to phase detection. When you use the viewfinder on a DSLR, you're using phase detection. There's actually dedicated sensor cells for focusing.
But it'll help set up your ISO
Yes,
shutter speed.
yes, you will preview the exposure doing that way, and a mirrorless camera does it right for you in the viewfinder. But anyway, yes, you can do it that way as well, and you can even zoom in on the image to help you manually. If you're going to manually focus, you can zoom in on the image and manually focus on it that way, so you get it nice, sharp, right on the thing. Now, this is a monster crop of a 24 megapixel image because I did not have my lens was basically 200 millimeters.
Oh.
So you need at least like a 600 millimeter lens or something like that to get a decent, a decent one with a crop, and then an 800 is for like a full frame. You want to get a good size shot, unless you have a full-on telescope, and even then, the smallest Celestron is a 1,000 millimeter lens. Like one of those Celestron catadioptric, the little fat short ones. Those are 1,000 millimeter lenses, and they're f8. Just to put things in perspective. Anyway, so that's it for the beginner class. We kind of kept it quick with the mode dial. We do have some club business we're going to attend to, but first let's go to the advanced class now. And here in the advanced class, yay, we're going to talk about one of the controls that people have a hard time getting their head around, and that's the exposure compensation dial. So, exposure compensation. No, it does not mean getting paid for your photographs. Okay? It literally means a control that biases the exposure one way or another, overriding the camera's single-minded desire to evenly expose the entire scene. Let me explain. Your camera, when it sees a scene like this shot here from the night garden, it creates a graph. And that graph tells you what it sees. The graph is displayed on the back of your camera. And we're going to talk about that next class, about the histogram, okay, and how to read the histogram. Okay? The left side of the histogram is black. The right side is white. The height is how bright. How much black, how much white, how much of that signal is there. It's all signal to noise ratio. So, if this shot here has a very large spike on the left side and a very small one on the right side, and not a lot of gray in the middle, okay? as far as luminance is concerned. So the problem here is that the camera wants to bring it to the middle. It wants to bring that graph to make it bulge up in the middle. It wants to bring it away from the blacks, and it wants to bring it away from the whites, and kind of bring it into the center, looking more like a bell curve. Okay, to kind of evenly expose the whole thing. Roughly. It's a simplified explanation. But in this case, I didn't want it to, because it was going to overexpose things, trying to get that black to have some detail in it, and I wanted the black to be there. I was more worried about the light lit up bits, and I didn't want them to be overexposed. Okay? So in this case, I had to use exposure compensation to keep things dark, so that the bright parts would stand out more against the black background, instead of the black background trying to light up to meet up with the bright stuff in the middle. So exposure compensation, like all things on a lot of things on a camera are measured in f-stops, just like your lens, just like your aperture. And you're basically adding a number of f-stops plus or minus to the exposure. So from a baseline of 0 f-stops, which means I have no compensation, that's what the camera says it should be. If it's overexposing your image for whatever reason, you dial in some negative exposure compensation to underexpose it. If it's underexposing your image, you dial in some positive exposure compensation to help bring that underexposure back up. When would that happen? Well, you bias it positively. Biasing it positively will favor slower shutter speeds, stop-down apertures, and higher ISOs in some combination. This is useful when the subject is wearing or is mostly white and will fool the camera into thinking it is brighter than it actually is. Okay? So in this case, when you have something that's super white, it will tend to underexpose the image. So you want to bring up the exposure, so you dial in some positive exposure compensation to make sure your whites are white and they don't start getting dingy and gray. Okay? Biasing the exposure compensation negatively favors faster shutter speeds, more open apertures, and lower ISOs, as if there was more light in the shot. And it's useful where the subject is either mostly wearing black or is in a dark situation, like, for example, Kyoto Tower there, which is at night. Kyoto Tower brightly lit, but if I were to try and it would try to evenly expose the sky, Kyoto Tower would look like it was exploding with light. And since I can't meter down to just Kyoto Tower, I dialed in some compensation to darken up the exposure a little bit. Okay? And that's really all you need to know about exposure compensation. And you can see it if you put your camera on live view. Okay, if your DSLR, you put it on live view and look at the scene of the thing. It's got the certain exposure. And then if you dial in some exposure compensation in either direction and then preview the exposure again, if you have live preview that's showing you what the exposure is going to be, you'll see if you dial in positive exposure compensation, it's going to get a lot brighter. And if you dial in negative exposure compensation, the image is going to get darker. And you can actually preview it ahead of time on the screen in back of your DSLR or in the viewfinder in a mirrorless camera. Okay? So now, that's the lesson for this month. I promised I would make it short because I've been going over a lot lately. So, challenge number 6. After dark. Go out and photograph a street scene after the sun has set. Now you might have noticed that the last bunch of challenges have always been doing stuff outside.
After Project Club member, but not a chance to photograph CDC in the dark.
I've been doing a lot of, the last 3 challenges have all been street photography. And in fact, the next bunch of challenges for the rest of the year are going to be all street photography. That way, I want you guys to get out there and go photograph stuff. Okay? And I've been picking and choosing these things to make it so that it's a reasonable amount. Because some of these challenges I've seen have been submit a set of 6 photographs. And it's like, okay. As always, we only ask for 3.
You always have.
Yeah. So that's it for the slideshow. And we're done there. So now let me go over here a second. Bring my mouse over there. I can't see it. Hang on. Escape. There we go. My mouse over there now. Oh, here's my mouse. And we're going to go.
Boardwalk.
Yeah. Here it is. All right. There's the group one. And I come over here to mine. And we're going to switch over to the Flickr page. All right, so there's our group page. We're going to be hopefully switching over there very shortly on the live stream. And let me come over here. Well, I'm going to have to look at it over there. So the last 2 challenges were a sign of the times and rules what rules. So at least Boris, you got a couple in. I put in some for rules what rules, because I had actually submitted the one for a sign of the times, which was my picture of don't touch the geishas, because that was just a weird sign.
Oh.
So anyway, here's my sample of rules, what rules. For example, in this one, the rule I broke was you always use a tripod to shoot fireworks.
Yeah.
So these are handheld fireworks shots. And over at the Mikasuki.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So, and if you ever want to do handheld fireworks shots, here's the trick. You're going to use a slower shutter speed, but then turn your camera to continuous shooting at high speed. So it's going to go and shoot, it's going to go hunk, 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 hunk. And so you might get a couple 3 in the middle that are good, that are not moved, you know. And that way you can actually do it without having to use a monopod or a tripod.
I've done that for lightning.
Hmm?
I've set it at slow.
Yeah.
And like you said, well, rapid fire.
Rapid fire, but slow shutter speed.
Yeah, and just hold it with the remote and just point it where it's supposed to happen and let it go. I may take 200-300 pictures, but I will get 3 or 4 lightning strikes.
Yep. Actually, the one that has the most interesting function for that is Olympus has a okay, so in the shutter speed dial, you always have these numbers, but then it goes down all the way to one that says B. B actually means bulb. And that was from the days when they would use a rubber bulb to push a plunger. You would screw this thing you would screw this cable into the shutter, and then you would squeeze the bulb, and it would push a plunger pneumatically into the shutter release, holding the shutter open, and it would stay open as long as you were squeezing the bulb, and then when you let go, it would close. Okay? The name is stuck. It's still called bulb mode. Okay? Now, with the electronic shutters and the electronics in the cameras, they have variations on it. They have the classic bulb mode where as long as I keep my finger on the shutter or I'm pressing the remote control, it's going to stay open until I let go. But then they have other ones where you press the button and it'll stay open until you press the button again. Now, Olympus has a variant of that goes and you take a base exposure, and then when you press the button again, it starts taking a a bulb exposure, but using the base exposure, it will not expose the parts that have not had any extra light added to it. So, for example, let's say you're at the blue hour, right? Just right after the sun is set and the sky is very rich azure colored blue. Azure, I don't know. How do they say it in England? Azure. Okay. Anyway, there's been a lot of discussion online as to how to pronounce that. But anyway, blue, blue, whatever. When the sky is super blue, the blue hour, but just before like the street lights have come on. So you could do this. You could set the camera up, take a photograph before the street lights come up, and then leave the camera open for like 5 or 10 minutes and when the street lights come up, it's not exposing the parts that you've already exposed that haven't had added any more light. In other words, the light values haven't changed or are getting darker. What it'll do is, as the street lights come up, it'll start adding the street lights, and then once it gets to a certain exposure limit, it won't take the street lights anymore because they haven't gotten any brighter. And then if cars are zooming by with their headlights on, then it'll start doing the trails. But you'll have, the final image will be the blue sky of blue hour with the light effects of a full night shot at one time. And it also happens to work fantastically for fireworks because you just put the camera on, turn it on, and let the fireworks go off, and it won't expose the fireworks more than they have to be, even though it stays open well beyond the firework. Now, if you leave it on too long, it just becomes this horrible giant blob of light because they fired so many fireworks. So you gotta kind of stop it every so often, right? So that was number 2. I think I did number 3 already. Okay, so this is yours. This is yours, Boris.
Yeah.
So rules, no rules. You didn't follow the horizon line.
Well,
That's breaking a rule.
That's right, yeah.
That's breaking a rule. Okay, and that is correct. And even then, like that, these always are interesting because even though you didn't break the horizon line, you still followed rule of diagonals. There is a rule of diagonals because you have the line here of the, where's my mouse? It's around there somewhere. Oh, there it is. So you have the line here of the waves forming a diagonal, and then it goes diagonally this way with the rocks. So you have the rule of diagonals followed, even though you broke the rule of following the horizon line. Okay? And over here.
I don't know if the second one was on one of the rocks, a little dead minnow.
Oh, yeah.
And there were some flags around it.
Yes, but basically you have it
Centered.
Dead centered mugshot.
Yeah.
Again, breaking a rule.
Yeah.
But you see, even though he broke the rule he didn't follow rule of thirds at all, you know, he just had it square in the middle, a mugshot. But in this case, it works. Simply because of the amount of surrounding material on it, and it adds to the starkness of the image.
I made it black black and white.
Mm-hmm. But that's the kind of things we were talking about with breaking the rules. If you want to look up someone who does a lot of that, there's a street photographer. He's been doing stuff since the 60s. His name is Daido Moriyama. Daido Moriyama. And he does a lot of things where he'll cut people's heads off. His images won't be straight or whatever, because he's literally a snapshot photographer. He does not worry about exposure or comment. And he was film. He was a film guy, and now he does digital, but he still likes to do film. But he doesn't care. He doesn't care. And his point was documenting, not creating, picture perfect, ideal solutions. So everybody else that's out there, now you've got 3 challenges you have to submit. Hello.
Oh, they're not hearing you.
They're not hearing me?
No, I'm chatting a little bit in the chat.
I'm not seeing anybody in the chat here.
This,
That's weird.
I got Miriam and I got Anna.
Okay, that's kind of strange. I don't know, something weird happened. It only says 1 person watching here on on my dashboard.
I see only 2 at the top there, but there are at least 3, but I don't know.
That's very odd, because I do have the microphone turned on and it's sending a signal. I mean, I'm pulling off of this mic.
I don't know.
That's very strange. Oh well, hopefully the recording will have audio on it. If not, I'm going to have to re-record the silly damn thing.
Without your audience.
Without my audience. Oh well. Anyway. Well, thank you for joining us. Sorry if there were some audio difficulties. This is always an ongoing struggle. Anyway, that's it for this month. Next month we will have our usual meeting. Same bat time, same bat channel. Have a good night, everyone, and we'll see you later.